The water always comes. In the Philippines, it's a fact of life. It comes from the sky in relentless monsoon waves. It comes from the sea in the fury of a typhoon. But this flood is different. This one rises from a broken promise. It seeps through the cracks of ghost projects that exist only on paper. It pours over phantom seawalls built with sand and lies. For 15 years, the nation spent over $1 trillion to hold back the deluge. So the question isn't why the water is rising. The question is, where did the money go? How did a system designed to protect a nation from disaster become a machine for plundering it? This isn't just a story about stolen money. It's about the true cost of corruption, measured in drowned homes, ruined lives, and the erosion of a nation's trust. It is a timeless battle, the people versus the system, and it reveals a shadow of history that refuses to fade. We are Asian Titans, and we are uncovering the shadows of history. If you want to join us for more investigations, make sure you subscribe. Now let's begin.
The Philippines is one of the most disaster-prone countries on Earth. An archipelago of over 7,000 islands, it sits squarely in the path of the planet's most powerful storms. Every year, the cycle repeats. Floods paralyze cities. They swallow entire villages. For millions, survival depends on infrastructure. Dikes, dams, and drainage systems are not luxuries, they're lifelines. Recognizing this, the government poured staggering sums of money into flood mitigation. Between 2022 and 2025 alone, over 545 billion pesos, that's nearly 10 billion US dollars, were allocated for thousands of projects. It was a declaration of war against the water. The war, however, was being lost, and the first public admission came from the top. In July 2025, President Ferdinand Marcos Jr. used his annual address to the nation to sound the alarm. Weeks later, the president himself stood on the banks of a river in Bulacan, inspecting a 96 million peso project. It was unfinished, structurally deficient. He called it a ghost. The concrete was so weak, it crumbled in his bare hands. The project, meant to protect a community, was a fraud. The president's admission opened the floodgates. Soon, whistleblowers emerged. A government engineer named Bryce Hernandez stepped forward, ready to expose the system from the inside. And at the center of the storm, a new breed of titans, contractors who had built empires on public funds. One couple, Sarah and Curly Discaya, became infamous overnight. Not for the projects they built, but for the fleet of luxury vehicles they owned. The public was outraged. The media was in a frenzy. But what they were seeing was just the surface. The crumbling dikes and phantom projects were not isolated failures. They were the end result of a sophisticated blueprint for a heist, a blueprint perfected more than a decade earlier.
The anatomy of the Floodgate scandal reveals a three-step process. It begins in the halls of power, in secretive, closed-door budget meetings. Here, lawmakers allegedly insert billions of pesos for specific flood control projects into the national budget, projects that are often redundant or completely unnecessary. Step 2. The monopoly. Investigators discovered that a tiny cartel of just 15 contractors had been awarded nearly 20% of the entire flood mitigation budget since 2022, a staggering 100 billion pesos. Some, like the Discayas, operated a web of 9 different firms. This allowed them to bid against themselves for the same government project, ensuring they would always win. Step 3. The kickback. Whistleblower Bryce Hernandez testified that a percentage of the project's cost, as high as 30%, was funneled back to the politicians who sponsored it. One senator called it a grand robbery, estimating that only 30 to 40% of the funds were ever used for actual construction. The rest simply vanished. This wasn't a new crime. It was an old script with new actors. A decade earlier, the Philippines was rocked by the pork barrel scam. The mastermind, Janet Lim Napolis, used a network of bogus organizations to siphon billions in legislative funds. The Floodgate scandal used the same playbook. Only this time, fake NGOs were replaced with shell construction companies. The system of plunder had simply evolved. As the hearings unfolded, the political fallout was immense. The House Speaker, a cousin of the president, was forced to resign. The country's Anti-Money Laundering Council froze 135 bank accounts. Contractors turned on politicians. Politicians turned on whistleblowers. The nation was captivated. But the organizers of the coming protest had a deeper narrative in mind. They chose a date seared into the national memory, September 21st, the 53rd anniversary of the day Ferdinand Marcos Sr. plunged the Philippines into 2 decades of dictatorial rule, a period defined by brutality, the suppression of democracy, and unprecedented corruption. The Marcos regime was a kleptocracy, a rule by thieves. It plundered an estimated $10 to $30 billion from the nation. Now, with his son and namesake back in the presidential palace, protesters were marching on the anniversary of his father's darkest act to condemn a corruption scandal unfolding on his watch. The protest was no longer just about stolen money. It was a march against a ghost. The question echoing in the streets was no longer just, where did the money go? But after 53 years, has anything really changed at all?
On September 21st, 2025, the people gave their answer. The Trillion-Peso March became one of the largest public demonstrations in recent memory. It was a broad coalition, church groups, students, labor unions, and ordinary citizens united by a shared fury. Crucially, this was not a movement to overthrow a leader. Organizers made it clear, no politicians were welcome on their stage. This was a protest against the entire system, a system of impunity that has festered for generations, allowing the powerful to treat the treasury of the bayan, the nation, as their personal bank account. In a move layered with historical irony, President Marcos Jr. declared his support for the protesters. If I wasn't president, I might be out in the streets with them. It was a calculated attempt to distance himself from a scandal protesters were explicitly linking to his family's legacy. So how did the system become a machine for plunder? The answer is that it never stopped being one. The kleptocracy of the first Marcos regime was never fully dismantled. The mechanisms of corruption were simply adapted by new players. The Floodgate scandal wasn't an anomaly. It was the system working as designed. The immediate aftermath is a nation in limbo. An independent commission is investigating. Assets are frozen. Careers are ruined. But the true titan, the culture of corruption itself, remains wounded but not defeated.
This is the price of forgetting. When a nation fails to fully reckon with the shadows of its past, those shadows grow longer, eventually consuming the present. The Floodgate scandal is more than a crime. It is a painful lesson in historical memory, a reminder that the fight for accountability is not a single event, but the work of generations. The rising waters in the streets of the Philippines are a mirror. They reflect not only the rain from the sky, but the deluge of deceit that has drowned the country's promises for half a century. And in that reflection, a new generation is asking if they can finally build a foundation strong enough to withstand the coming storm. If you want to uncover more of history's darkest secrets, subscribe to Asian Titans.